Ethnic slurs are something that many people are taught are wrong and hurtful. Still, few people discuss why that is. Professor Elizabeth Stordeur Pryor does discuss this material as part of her teachings at Smith College. And I sat down with Pryor and 3 students of hers to learn more.
We didn't discuss it, but it was used in my household. My father was African American, and for a long time...
Your dad's Richard Pryor.
My dad is Richard Pryor, and for a long time it was just a word used in our household. It was, I think the way young people would describe it is he used the, GA, the softer version, the version that African Americans use among each other and with each other. But yeah, he used it in that way frequently, and we never really talked about what it meant or where it came from and who got to use it, and it never felt comfortable coming from my mouth. And I think that's partially because I was biracial and kind of in these multiple worlds at once, and kind of felt it was a word that always made me feel apart instead of a part of, apart from.
So something separating you.
It separated me. It separated me because of the way I feared that white people would use it towards me and the way that they have. And also separated me in terms of the kind of community building that it was doing among African Americans, because I felt apart from that as well.
Shalina, I saw you nodding your head a moment ago when the professor was speaking, especially when she said, GA. For the folks who might not know what that is, can you explain what that concept is?
Well, that concept is more of, it's a familial term that we use. It's more of a term of endearment. I'm also biracial, so I come from a household where, my mom is white, my dad is black, but we never had that conversation. It just was a word that was used because we heard it in music. We used it in the streets. For me, it was comfortable to use because of the community that we were in.
So something that sort of built a kinship or familiarity.
Right. It lets you know that you were part of the in. You were allowed to say it by being in that group, and you couldn't say it if you weren't in that group, which was, And
so to that point, that this language is acceptable in certain communities, not acceptable in others, I think that's part of what makes this a difficult conversation for people to have, right? People don't want to hurt, hopefully. People don't want to offend. When you're looking at this in a classroom setting then, with the idea that there's going to be some framework, there's going to be some foundation, right? I understand you talk about the history of this type of language before it's even introduced in the classroom setting. Is that something that it makes you nervous to know that it will be discussed, or something that gives you some relief knowing, okay, there's a framework for this, we're going to discuss this in a way that's respectful to everybody? What were you thinking about leading up to some of the discussions you had in the classroom?
For me, I think it was a little bit of both. It's definitely something that makes you nervous, especially if, like myself, I don't come from a community where it's used frequently. I went to a majority white high school, elementary school, middle school, everything. And so I was definitely nervous, especially given that the professor's classroom is fairly diverse, especially compared to other classes that we take at Smith. But on the other hand, I liked that she had a framework, and I liked that she had done it before and she knew what to expect, and that I felt comfortable, especially because we did it later on in the class. I think that helped. I don't know if you guys agree, but I think once you get to know people a little more in the class and do work with them, you're a little more comfortable opening up, but it's never going to be easy.
So Camille, for you, taking part in some of these discussions, what came to mind for you?
I think it was an interesting conversation to have. My family is Vincentian. We come from St. Vincent, so I'm first generation American. And in my household, we don't use that word. And I don't think I really heard it until I started interacting with people in my neighborhood. I'm from Brooklyn, from Bed-Stuy. And people would use it frequently, and I had never really heard of it. And then when I went to private school and I was around predominantly white students, they'd use it very often. So coming to a classroom, yeah, they would. They'd use it often. And so when I got to college and I took part in this class, I actually thought it was a great conversation to have, because I'd been in a situation where it was uncomfortable for my white peers to say this, and I wasn't sure if coming to this class, my professor would agree that white people shouldn't be saying the word. So I thought it was a great conversation to have, and I felt safer after partaking in this conversation.
And Professor, I know that this is something that you teach in a workshop setting too, for middle school and for high school educators, right?
Yeah.
How do you help teachers understand how to introduce parts of this conversation. It's a difficult conversation for people to have.
I want to admit that I'm just starting doing this work and I'm developing the workshops, but I've had to. A lot of what's happened in my classroom has been really organic, but in imagining the workshops, I've had to break down what my actual process has been. So I'm thinking about it specifically. One of the things I do is I set it apart the very first day of class, and I let everybody know this is coming. We're going to be doing this work halfway through the semester. And I also, at that point, establish a policy, which is until we have the conversation and work through it, we're not going to ever say the actual word in the class. We're going to say the euphemistic phrase, the N-word. I don't see that as censorship. I see that as an opportunity for everybody to come to the table, because the N-word, despite the fact that it's being quoted from something old or quoted from literature, it's still doing real work in the present. It's still violent, and still saying some people are better than others, some people are worth more than others. So I don't think we can step fully away from that, even when we're quoting it from literature and quoting it from history. So I make that policy clear. I set it apart. I make plain that we're going to do it halfway through the semester. And I also think it's really important that it's relevant to the work that we're doing in the class. So I don't think somebody who's, just doing white women writers from England should focus on the N-word in their class, unless it comes up in that work. And I think one of the most important things for me to convey is creating the kind of space for students to be able to have that kind of conversation. So building that, to honor the space, to respect each other, when we're talking. But I think it's important too for teachers to get the history, which is part of, I'm going to do a mini lecture of what I do for these folks in my class, of kind of the origins of how this word went from being a word that just described a worker to being the virulent anti-Black, racist, vile language that it became and what it represented, and taking people so that they understand what they're dealing with when they teach it.
But when we hear this word in music or in literature, as you say, I think Huck Finn is the book that stands out for most folks that uses that word quite often. But also in art, how do we separate, or should we separate, its appearance in popular culture versus how it may or may not be folded into everyday language? That, to me, seems like something that could be in conflict with one another.
I think if you look at it kind of straight on, it seems like they're more conflated than they are. But if you take the time to really think about every time that you interact with that word or any sort of language like that, there's a definite choice that you have. I can listen to Jay-Z, I can like Chris Rock, and I cannot say it back. There's nothing that means just having exposure to that or enjoying it for entertainment purposes when it's part of a larger work. I don't think that necessarily conflates with what I do in my life or how I address people.
Yeah, and I think comedians, whether it's Red Fox or your father, Richard Pryor, who use, whether it's a racial slur or just charged language in general, as a way to, I think, get people to engage with the community, as each of you say. How do you, or is it important for you to make that distinction for people? Like, these are distinctly different things.
Well, I mean, I have an article that I wrote about kind of the emergence of this word in popular culture in the 1830s. And even though many people think that the word, after the 1960s becomes two words and splits, and, after hip-hop becomes two words, really the evidence says that it was two words from almost the very beginning, that Black people used the words with each other and among each other in a particular way to kind of signify community. That was very different from the mocking way in which whites were using it in minstrel shows to kind of disparage Blackness. So it's sort of disingenuous for white people to say, no, we're going to be using it in this other way. I don't think it's really possible for white people, not yet, not in the racial climate that exists, that's afraid to talk about race, that's afraid to talk about the N-word. Can we have a situation in which whites can use this word without being connected to that deep racist past in the way that it is? Yeah.
For each of you, I know that you've discussed this now in the classroom setting. Have you walked away with a different perspective than maybe you went in with as a result of the discussions you've had?
I definitely walked away feeling like it's so much more complicated and complex than I originally thought. I just thought it was simple. Non-Black people cannot say this word, and Black people can use it however they want. But after taking Elizabeth Pryor's class, I just written and discussing it with everyone in the class. It's just, there's no easy answer. You come away with like, I have these new thoughts, but I still can't go to either side anymore. It's not so black and white.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to add anything?
I think that being in a classroom discussing this with a variety of people who come from different backgrounds, it's kind of changed the way I view the conversation. I think that before it was just like, okay, like Shay said, like, don't say it if you're not black, and that's it. And I also thought about the fact that maybe the black community should definitely have a conversation about this, because I feel like a lot of the conversations that happen have to do with people that aren't black engaging with this word and trying to figure out whether or not we should say it or not. And I think that while being in that classroom, I noticed that black people themselves, like, we don't talk about it that much. We don't actually know whether or not we want to keep using this word or whether or not we don't want to. But I also realized that every time I hear the word, I'm engaging with it in a different way. And people say it meaning different things every time they say it. So I think that everything, it just kind of depends. And I think that different people need to start having this conversation.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in and taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.